Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our art talk here at the El Paso Museum of Art. My name is Claudia Presa, the assistant curator here, and it's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed speaker for today, multimedia visual artist Isadora Stowe. Stowe Arts focuses on the narrative of the environment, translated and coded into complex psychological landscapes. She grew up in the southwest border region, living and working in New Mexico, Texas, and Mexico. Stowe credits these experiences for providing a heightened awareness of geographical and political boundaries, as well as a fascination with the exploration of identity of self and the construction of home in her work. Stowe earned her MFA in painting and drawing and BFA in painting with a double major in cultural anthropology. Her works are in the permanent collections of the University of New Mexico, Taos and Gallup Campuses, Western New Mexico State University, and the City of El Paso. Notably, she earned an award for excellence from the New Mexico Committee of the National Museum of Women in the Arts. Please join me in welcoming Isadora Stowe.
Hi, can you guys hear me? Okay, let's see if I have this on too. No, I don't. Okay. Now I do. All right, thank you guys so much for being here. It's so nice to see everybody. I am so honored to be here, and I'm going to show you some reasons why. Let's see. One of them, oh my God, it's because I'm going to keep doing this. Sorry, I forget. So this is from a survey done in 2018. So it's pretty recent, right? About the kinds of things that we see in institutions, in museum institutions. And for the most part, they're 87% male and 85% white. So when I say I'm really honored to be here, I know that what it means to be in a museum, to be a female artist, to have a solo exhibition in a museum, and to have people come and want to hear about the art and want to participate in seeing that work. It's a big deal. So you're part of that process of breaking down those barriers, so I really appreciate you for being here. Let's see, there we go. But the other reason why I'm here is because all of these people who work for this wonderful museum worked so incredibly hard to get me here and to support me once I was here. Here I have people working on all aspects of this project, this exhibition, and if you look at my Instagram, I have so many more pictures. It was really hard to pick which one would work best. But all of these people, Ben, Claudia, Irene, Nick, Bernadette, Josephine, Ivan, Mujo, Alex, Natalia, and Diego, really put in so much effort, time, and support into making this exhibition a possibility. And I like to start off most of my artist talks with this quote, which is, as soon as you are born, you are given a name, a religion, a nationality, and race. You spend the rest of your life defending a fictional identity. Because I like for us to think about who we are as people, and that it's not this kind of, we come out as a clean slate, or we're original in some kind of a way, right? We are products of all of these things that are kind of hard to move through and think of ourselves as people without really attributing a lot of the reasons why we do what we do to circumstances beyond our control, right? So I also like to start with talking about my parents because they are major influences on my life, and they're the reason why I do what I do, and the way I see the world is because of them. They were both kind of the black sheep of their family. In the 1960s, they decided to do something really crazy, which was leave their families and join the Peace Corps. And they met in Asmara, Ethiopia, in the Peace Corps in the 60s. They were both from different religions. They spoke different languages in their homes. They were from East Coast and West Coast, and they had very different worldviews. But they were able to kind of come together, and their love for travel, adventure, going against the grain, created this bond. And then I was born. So sometime in the 70s, I was born from these two people who kind of had a different way of thinking about the world and thinking about how we exist in the world, even though we are born into different ways of seeing, how do we kind of navigate ourselves? And so my upbringing is highly influential. And I like to think about time as those theories of internalism, that all these things are happening at one time. So I'm just being born right now. My son's being born right now. All these parts of our lives are happening together. Time as a construct is something that I think about a lot. So talking about our early days or who we are as people when we grow up really influences everything that we're doing right now. So I say this quote a lot because I think it's pretty funny, but it's probably just funny to me. And that's that I didn't choose the art life chose me. And that's because my dad was an artist. And for as long as I can remember, I was always using art supplies. And it was the way that I learned first how to express myself. I'm not so good with words, but with art, with images, with drawing, that's the way that I feel like I can communicate my innermost feelings to other people. And so this is how I remember seeing my dad. He was always making something, always using different art supplies. He's a printmaker. And so I actually thought that when people traveled, they went to art museums and learned about art. And I found out later that's not really the case, right? People go for all sorts of reasons to different places. But I had a really early education in art history. And so it really informed the way that I chose to spend my time. I have 3 other siblings, 2 of which are a doctor and one's a financial assistant, or he owns a finance company. So it didn't stick with them, but for some reason it stuck with me. And so when I start to show you my work, and you can understand where I'm coming from, these are the major tenets in my work. My work is about the investigation and how we interpret, construct, and negotiate our worlds. And the major themes of my work are about the connections we make with one another, how we culturally negotiate space and self, rites of passage, and ideas of transformation and liberation. So this is 20 years ago in the 1990s. This was my first solo exhibition. And I'm very interested in female portraiture. And I'm very interested in how women are experiencing the world, their inner dialogues, their place in the world. And so this exhibition was a series of 20 paintings of friends that I knew and interviews that I had with them, and how did I articulate that in oil paint. This was one of the smaller pieces, but they were very large oil paintings, multimedia pieces. But then I started to take this idea of the figure, the actual physicality of a figure, and I tried to make it more surrealistic. So surrealism is it's this movement that really came out of World War II and out of Sigmund Freud's idea of the inner self, the psychosis and the psychology of the inner self, and that movement, which kind of paralleled Dadaism and came out of Dadaism, but it really was about this idea that we could liberate ourselves through art. We could talk about our inner selves, because if we remember psychology, it really isn't until then that people start to think about their inner selves and how do you articulate that and how do you have a conversation about that. And in art, it wasn't really accepted until surrealism was this kind of movement after Dadaism. So this is a surrealistic image. I'm working more in surrealism. I'm talking about the inner self, but I'm trying to use animals and different objects as metaphors and as symbols of our inside thoughts. So this is also supposed to be inside of a mouth, but it's also a stage, and it's also the inner being. So you can see how the figure is starting to kind of get smaller and smaller and less important. The animals are starting to take over, the symbolic code's starting to take over, till I pretty much take them all out altogether, and I start to use animals because I'm really interested in that negative space. And so it was about psychology, but I thought if I had negative space and if I have shadows that are coming in different places, so these shadows are not correctly painted technically, they're alluding to a different kind of space. At the time I was interested in quantum mechanics, quantum physics, still am, and it was informing my idea of a time and space. I started using smaller animals, I started integrating a lot of birds into my work. And I was talking a lot about string theory and the idea that everything is connected. And so many of the things in my objects were connected by this actual string, to reference string theory, of this idea of trying to delineate ourselves from one another, but we're actually really physically connected. And this is graduate school, and I was a little stressed out. I had a small child. I couldn't paint, and those big paintings that I had before, I had to paint on paper. I used a toolbox that had all my supplies in it, and I went from room to room. And when he was in one room, I would paint on something, and then I would tear up these pieces of paper, and I would fragment them, and then I would put them in these kinds of installations. And so I really had to work differently because of my circumstance. And I also was seeing the world completely differently because I had become a parent. And I was going to school with a lot of people who were in their 20s, and who just didn't have kids. I was the only one I knew who had a child. And all the visiting artists who were coming, none of them had kids. None of the women who actually did come, because it was mostly male artists that we would see, or we would see in the textbooks, or we would talk about their work or see their examples. They were all men, and if they were women, they did not have children. And so I was hearing these messages over and over again about how trying to make it as an artist and as a parent was going to be very challenging, and I just couldn't find these role models. And I started thinking about this more and more, this idea of fragmentation, and I wanted to lure people into these installations so that the paintings kind of went off of the paintings onto the wall. It was color. The images are also echoing there, so that when you walk in, it was more of a physical space that you could enter. So I'm trying to push that negative space in these. See that otter right there? Some of the birds. These objects are more isolated. You can still see a turtle. But can everybody see this color? Yeah? How does it make you feel when you see that color? Happy? Relaxed. What? Stressed? Okay. Jittery? Okay. Well, this is what's called Baker pink, excuse me. And Miller pink is a certain kind of pink. And what they found out through these psychological studies is that if you put somebody in a room full of this Miller pink, it'll calm them down. So a lot of police stations and places and institutions had these rooms that were all pink, and they would put people in them who were very violently aggressive or very drunk, and they just couldn't get people to calm down, or children who were having a lot of stress, and if you brought them into one of these pink rooms, they would instantly calm down. So a football coach heard about this. This guy, Hayden Fry, in the University of Iowa, and he thought, I'm going to use this to my advantage. So he painted the opposing team's locker that Barker Miller pink. And they won by a landslide. They were underdogs. And what happened is after that, the NFL banned this practice because it was interfering too much with the psychology of the players, right? It was calming people down. And I thought this was really interesting, right? How can color influence us so much when we're trying so hard to do something the opposite way? And there's another study that I was also interested in, and this is London's Friar Bridge. And they had a problem with people committing suicide off of this bridge in England. We don't have firearms like we have in America, which is the most popular way for people to kill themselves. Sorry, I didn't think I'd be talking so much about killing ourselves in this talk. But anyways, you get the point. So they painted it green. They were trying to solve this problem. And by painting it green, 35% of the suicides stopped. So it's not like people walked up to this bridge and they thought, oh, green, I've changed my mind, right? But what happens is we're so influenced by our environments and by color and all of these things that are happening that we don't necessarily give a lot of credence to, right? And so this is something that I wanted to really explore in my work. So here we have the same green, right? But I thought, what if I take these happier colors and I talk about things that are a little bit more dark, there was more struggles, but I also have all of these things that happen in life, right? The good, the bad, and if you walk into a room and you have this color, how is it going to make people feel? So I was really interested in not only the imagery, but the color having this kind of influence on the viewer. And I'm also an art educator. I'm a professor of art, and I'm really interested in getting people into museums and getting people to value art. And so part of this is, the psychology of this is bringing people into the space and letting them have a relationship with art in a way that maybe they hadn't thought of or hadn't experienced before. So this is another installation. It's a little bit blurry, bear with me. But what you can see, what you get the gist of, is there's a lot of movement in this image, right? And so I was thinking about this idea of kind of manipulating space, right, and the viewer's experience. And I was also a parent of a small child who, some of you may be parents of small children, but you know that they don't want to ever not be next to you, right? And so my son was in my studio with me all the time. Here he is. And I decided to take my drawings, the ones that I just showed you here, trace them over Mylar, trace them over his drawings, fuse them together, add some string. I'm talking about string theory. I'm talking about consciousness, that we're all kind of the same beings. I'm talking about these little moments of time, all the minutia that goes into parenting and being a caregiver. And I'm putting them together into this work. And I also, at the time, was married to an archaeologist, and we had a CRM, a cultural resource management company, where what you do is you survey land for any archaeological remains. So before somebody, like the government, like Fort Bliss, is going to blow up an area, you have archaeologists come out and you survey the area, and then you look for any remnants of past life, and if you find it, you move it, and then they blow stuff up. And I just thought that was kind of an interesting premise for how we kind of deal with the world and deal with our past and deal with place. And I'm also really interested in how we delineate borders, living on the border and thinking about people who are here are one way and people who are here after this imaginary line or a physical line are very different. And so I'm using these different shapes and sizes to create this sense of movement, and I started to use the topographical maps in the actual installations as well. And here are some of these circles. They have more abstracted backgrounds, and then you have your object kind of more isolated. And then I wanted to go bigger and bigger, and so this was another exhibition in Kentucky, and this was like the longest continuous wall in all of Kentucky in a gallery, so I was pretty excited about that. It was humongous space, but what I wasn't excited about was the top of this, how it kind of stopped. In the pictures and in the schematics she gave me before I got there, because of course when you go to a place you're just installing it one time, I didn't realize that it stopped in that way. And so for me that really kind of set up this idea of how I wanted to expand this work. So another thing happens, and that is one of my close friends lives in New York City. She's an artist, and we have this thing that we do when I go to New York City. She plans out everything we're going to do. I don't know what we're going to do. She just surprises me, and we just go see art all day long. And so one of these trips, she took me to the Guggenheim. This is what the Guggenheim looks like if you're not familiar, and this is what it looks like inside. And so we were going to the Guggenheim. She doesn't tell me the artist. I didn't look it up before I got there because I'm a parent, I'm working triple overloads, and I'm just so super excited just to be out of town, right? So we get there, and we walk in, and it's James Turrell. And I've read about James Turrell, and I've seen his work before, but I didn't fully understand it until I experienced it. It's really one of those things, just like all art, that once you experience it, it can completely change your experience with the work and how you understand it. And so the entire room was built up of this light. He had transformed the whole thing. And so what happens is the light changes in this room. So that's it, basically, for this exhibition. There were other drawings that were phenomenal, and they were amazing. But what's happening here that you see is all these people are laying down, right? And it was spontaneous. As the color changes, you're in this room. It's pretty incredible. And these are the pictures that I took. I was just blown away by all these people just laying down on the floor, right? It's dirty, it's New York City, right? They don't know each other, but look how close they are to one another. This is pre-COVID, right? So they're sitting together and they're just all enjoying art. And as an artist and as a person who teaches about art, this was so wonderful for me to see how all these people came together and they were having this experience, and they were just really loving what was going on. And also, I noticed this guy's shoes, right? I'll talk to you about his shoes in a little bit later. So the next exhibition that I had after the one in Kentucky, I think there might have been one in between, but was in Juarez, and I started using colored light gels, and instead of painting on the wall. So it was a way to kind of transform those ideas. And I'm using maps, and I'm using the iconography, and now the paintings are coming out in this abstracted art. So I'm trying to reflect the paintings inside of the box, inside of the color, and then as the light changed in the room, the exhibition changed. And so your experience in the room with the paintings would change over time. Here's another picture of the image. So you can see that this is one of the images, and here it is blown up on the wall. And these also created these shadows. So you can see kind of these different shadows that are happening with the pieces. And that was also really interesting to me, these colored shadows. So it's like these paintings are starting to create another space and another place in the world. And I'm really interested in shadows just from a psychological perspective. There are things called like the shadow self, where you think about all these parts of yourself that are not necessarily the good parts, right? But they're the parts that make up who we are. We're both the bad and the good and all of these things. And how do they live together and how do we negotiate them? I don't know why I can't move. I'm trying to move it to the next one, but it's not. There we go. Did I fast forward? No. Okay. So this is at Charles Adams Studio Project in Lubbock, Texas. And if you don't know what an artist residency is, Google that if you're an artist. That's something that you should try to do, because these are fantastic places where they will pay you money to come and make your work and experiment and use different kinds of supplies. And so that's what I did. Was I actually took my son with me. It wasn't a residency for children, but I talked them into it and they let me bring them, which was pretty great. But we need more residencies for artists' parents. And I made all these drawings. I made all these drawings from my paintings. And then I started thinking about what would happen if I put those things together and I created movement, right? Could I make movies out of this imagery? It's not going. And so here's an example of one of the images, and then that image is then traced and then placed on top of other images that have been silhouetted. And this is the video that was being shown in that show. So it's an imagery of the same imagery that's in the paintings, that's on the wall, that's now moving in the video. And I like this idea of silhouettes. One of my favorite artists is Kara Walker, who works exclusively in silhouettes. And the way that she's able to articulate these narratives just out of a silhouette, there's so much that you can gain just from a silhouette of an object. It's giving you even less information, but then you're filling in all of the pieces. Just like a lot of Greek art, it has these things that are wrapped around it, and it's not actually the body form, but what our mind does is we fill in all the spaces. So I'm thinking about how do we fill in all the spaces, and we make our own stories when we see these images. And then I started making these images start to float and move, so you can kind of see them, but they're hanging from the wall and then moving around. And this is done in like a foam core, a very soft foam core that I was cutting out, and Mylar. You can kind of see them a little bit better here. And they start to create these shadows on the wall, and so they're starting to move because I wanted people to be inside of the video. I'm always trying to get you closer inside of the art. And then I was able to work with Texas Tech and make all of these laser cuts out of the actual objects. So I learned how to do that for a month, and I would print these out, and then I would paint them. And then I would attach them to the wall, because I'm not a 3D person. I'm really into 2D work, and I couldn't really understand how to use them in a way that would be best reflective of a three-dimensionality from something that was 2D. But I think I've kind of resolved it by the time we get to today, in a way. So here are different iterations of these on the wall and these installations at the artist residency. And this was at this museum in 2016, where I have all the images that are cut out in this installation sitting outside of the other pieces, which this was a really wonderful experience to get to come to the museum in 2016. And I had just really hoped that someday I would have a solo here. So it's pretty exciting to be here, standing here, telling you this, looking at these. That's string theory at work. Here's just a side view of some of these pieces, but you can see some of them are a little bit more isolated. Like this image was from Lubbock. It was from going on walks in the city and picking up flowers, and the flower recording this kind of time that I felt. So when I look at this, it encapsulates a moment in time for me. But you'll also see this in the exhibition that's here today. Downstairs is the same image has been cut out a million different times. So it exists as part of my vocabulary. And so what I did was I had all of my paintings, hundreds of paintings, and I traced over them, and then I made drawings of the paintings, and I isolated them. So here are some other images, and maybe if you've seen the exhibition downstairs, you'll start to notice that there's a lot of images that you see over and over again. For instance, this is the ship that my stepmom found from my dad's family. It's the ship that my great-grandfather came to America in. And so that ship and the different images are placed together to create these kind of surrealistic codes and texts. And so then what I also do is I have this kind of classification and taxonomy system of all of these different images. And when I was putting together this presentation, I was trying to show you all of these things. I just want to reiterate that maybe you're an artist, or maybe you're thinking about making work, maybe this seems like it was a straight line trajectory, but there's all these other places that all of my work went. I'm giving you a cleaner, edited version of how we got to today. But when you're working, sometimes you don't know why you're working or what you're doing or what these things mean. It's not till a little bit later that you get that clarity and reflection when you can look back at your work and try to understand what you're doing, even though you just feel compelled to make these things. So being compelled to make something and not knowing how it's going to end up or where it's going to go is a really valid artistic response. And so I started organizing these and giving them their own meaning and thinking about their meaning and diving into that a little bit more. And then I started making them all into screen prints because, again, like I said, I was busy. I have a child. I'm working triple overloads. I'm doing all this stuff, and I realized if I made these into screen prints, I could work even faster than I did before. And so then I started putting the screen prints of the images onto circles. This is a wood circle, and I started layering them. So when you see a screen print, an image, each one of those is one individual screen print, and then I was mixing all the colors, because as we know, the screen print inks, there's a limit to the amount of screen print colored ink that exists in the world. And I also started using stencils and spray paint as well with the work. And so I had these different shapes. I'm talking about time as a cyclical idea, the idea of shared consciousness, all these kinds of things existing in this realm. And then I had them start to push off and fly off of all of the pieces in the installation. So that when the viewer was, I'm going so quick. When the viewer was watching them, they could make their own stories about what was happening. So it was non-linear, but it was a way that there was a story being told with the imagery as it was bursting out of these objects. And then I started adding light to the wood objects. So they're light gels, and this was a place where, of course, you can see these are windows, right? So as light changes in the room, like for instance here, and as the light dimmed, the light would come up a little bit differently. There would be shadows on the work again, and then they would also be light sensitive. So I started using light sensitive paint, fluorescent paint, and glow-in-the-dark paint, archival glow-in-the-dark paint on the work, so that it would have this kind of afterlife, so that as you saw it in one way and experienced it, just like we do in the way that we think that our lives are, or memory is made up. We know that memory is not really that accurate. We start to put things together and we start to re-remember who we are. We're making it up every time we kind of think back about something. So it was really important to me that the viewer would have this relationship with the work, that it would give them so much more. It would give them all these different layers and ways to be able to see what was happening and create these different kinds of narratives. And this all really goes back to seeing that guy's shoes back in James Turrell's exhibition. They were glowing, and there were different parts of people that were glowing while I was sitting in there, and all I could think about was when I was laying down was that, what if this was also glowing? So his shoes were the inspiration for this glow and this way of interacting. But really, what a lot of these shows were teaching me was that I really wanted to experiment with relational art, and that is where art is the goal is to create a social circumstance. The viewer experience of the constructed social environment becomes the art. These are all photos I pulled from Instagram, and these were all things that people posted about their experience with the work. And this was also one of those shows where nobody knew who I was. When I got to the show, I got in there late because I had left work, and I had to drive 6 hours, and when I got there, people were just talking about the work, and they had no idea who I was. And it was so exciting to me to hear people understanding it and getting it and having this different kind of experience. And so I was hooked from then on to make these kinds of experiences for people that I didn't have to be there, I didn't have to guide you through. It was something that everybody could have their own personal relationship with the work. And so I started working with Mylar as well to push this idea, and this is also acrylic. So this is see-through plastic or plexiglass, right? And when you stood in front of these, the color would change, and your shadow would change the artwork. And then I had an exhibition where I wanted to push these elements all together, and I used colored light gels on all of the windows in the room, so it created this kind of biosphere when you walked in. And I started making these a lot more busy, and there's a lot of spray paint, a lot of stencil, and a lot of glow in the dark with the imagery. So the pieces came all the way from the top of the sky, kind of falling in and bursting around in this environment. And then I also started working with projection mapping, thanks to Laura Turan, who helped me realize this idea. So the objects in here are Mylar, and on top of them is their insect pins, so they're coming from the wall. And then there's projected video on top of them. So what that means is the video is the shape of the objects, but the video is also a video of the objects. It's like meta, 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 meta. And when you're standing in front of it, you start to have this different kind of experience because of the way the shadows work. You change the artwork. So again, I was taking this idea and then pushing it a little bit more. After that, I was asked by Sharbani Dasgupta. She's an artist who was having an exhibition at the Roswell Museum of Art, and she wanted to collaborate on some ideas and talking about birds and kind of manufactured ideas of ecology, not ecology, but of nature and how we interact with nature. And so I started thinking about plastic and how can you seal up, birds inside of plastic, because we have this relationship with nature where we think it's beautiful, we love it, but we're not necessarily good stewards of our environments, right? We love it as it interacts with us. And so that's what I'm trying to say in these pieces. And I made many of them, and the birds are kind of looking back at you. They're enclosed in these objects, and they're also having a relationship with you. They're breaking that third wall, right? They're telling you they know that they're there. This is part of the installation. There were these fabricated pipes that she made to look like trees, and here are the birds. This is me hanging some stuff. The birds hanging off of these trees. But I was also going back to a lot of my MFA work. So this is 2010, right? And I'm thinking about all those ideas and the ideas of string theory and being connected to things and where I was during that time period and how I was feeling psychologically. And I was trying to incorporate all these ideas back into my newer work by still referencing all these things that had held my attention for so long. And starlings were one of those things. And I started investigating starlings a little bit more and started thinking about how they actually communicate. They are an invasive species, unfortunately, but they have this way of, actually 80% of them, their numbers are really declining, but in order to protect themselves from predators, and stay warm, they create these kinds of like hives together. They create what's called murmurations, also known as swarm behavior. And that occurs when hundreds of thousands of animals or entities move together as one. And this is a really interesting phenomenon, right? Bees do it, certain bacteria do it, cancer does it in the human body. These things kind of talk to each other. It's called swarm behavior, and that's what we're looking at to model a lot of artificial intelligence right now. How do we have all these things that aren't physically next to each other communicate in a way that creates this kind of swarm behavior? And so I was thinking about these ideas, and I'm thinking about how to create these ecosystems and how we create our own ecosystems, right? We create our own meaning. Everything is constructed. Culture is a construct, right? So we create our ways that we identify with one another and how we see ourselves in the world. And I was thinking about encapsulating it into these own little orbs, these own little micro organisms of universes. And so I started working on the plexiglass in this way. And again, I'm really interested in the shadows that it creates on the wall. And here, and then they become a lot more kind of opaque, and then they have these kinds of cutouts. This is a close-up. I just love it because it's so much happening, right? Like sometimes our brains, when we think about things, they have all these different layers and so much chaos, right? But really all the chaos, if we delineate and dissect it, it all becomes these other little things. And of course, I was interested in using the light reflective paint on these. And thinking about how these could work with light, with shadow, and glow. And here we're going to talk about quantum entanglement. You didn't think you were going to come and have this kind of science lesson, but I'm going to try to do it really, really quick because it's an important part of the work that you see downstairs. And it's also a really interesting concept if you don't already know about it. So it's, of course, a theory. It's a theory, right? We don't know. But the idea is basically that we see these two objects, right? This is yellow and red. We see these two things that exist in space. But when we observe them, they act differently. So this is what happens in physics, is that when, for instance, this woman's saying mine is yellow, and he's saying his is yellow too, and as soon as it changes, right, there's an element that changes. Mine is red. His will also be red. But also, if she starts to observe it and she sees it a little bit differently, it'll start to change the state of it. Okay? And then if he thinks of it a little bit differently as well. So I'm going through like something that's very, very complicated, but you're getting the gist of it, right? Things are spooky. Things happen that we don't necessarily have the answers for. Again, these are theories, and this is the way that we kind of see the universe. But what I'm trying to reiterate here is that we think we know the way the world works, and we think we have ideas about how things are, but we really don't, right? There's so much that happens, and so many different ways we're connected to one another. So I'll give an example. have you ever just thought of somebody and then the phone rings, right? There are all these different things that physics talks about. The phone rings and it's the person. Sorry, I didn't give you that part. But there's all these different things that physics can explain and can't explain that are pretty interesting, that talk about consciousness and shared consciousness and all of these ideas that actually Buddhism has been talking about for a long time, like Indra's net, and this way that we're all kind of reflective jewels of one another in this bigger kind of lake or river of consciousness, net of consciousness. So I'm trying to take this work and I'm trying to create a way that if these people see it, will it change color, right? In some kind of a way. But how does the experience of the viewer seeing these objects change how we're all experiencing these objects? So I'm thinking about these concepts, and I'm also cutting out the objects in plexiglass, and they're coming from the wall, and these also all glow. And in this last exhibition, this one was called Beacon at Western State University. It had these great skylights, and so I decided to put the colored light over the skylights so that as the day changed, the exhibition would change. The experience would change. When it gets darker at night, it can start to glow a little bit differently. And then you can also use the flashlights, just like you can use in the show downstairs, and they'll show you different parts of that glow and light up, so that everybody walking through has essentially their own beacon, and they're able to have an experience with the work that's very individualized. These are some more examples of how it starts to look in different colors. This is part of the installation called murmuration. So I'm talking about murmuration of birds, murmuration of different objects having communication with one another and kind of bursting out from the floor. This is what it looks like at different times of the day. These are some close-ups of some of these pieces. Here's another image. So I got my wish. People are being bathed in that colored light, right? All the way from Terrell. And then there was a room that was full of the projection mapping. So now, and the color is different, so that people could be inside of this enclosed space of color with the video. And then I started expanding from just the birds, and I started expanding all my iconography onto these small pieces, like the ones you'll see in illuminated downstairs. And in one of the pieces that's downstairs, I'm just showing you how different it looks by themselves, because most of them are layered together. So they're layered circles, and I have to work backwards. So this is screen printing, but I have to be able to see what it looks like from one side, and I actually keep the coating on it so that when I take it off, it's the surprise of how it turns out. So I have these ideas of how I think it's going to work, but it is always a surprise once I take off the other side and see how they look to the viewer. So these three pieces are what make up this piece that's in the show downstairs, just to give you an idea. And then when you look at the shadows also make another color. And within this exhibition, what we did was we cut out circles. The circle is white, meaning it wasn't painted black, so that you would be able to still see all of these circles, and it glows as well. And I also started experimenting with glitter, spray paint, glitter, which I was so excited to find out that existed. A lot of car enamel spray paint. So I'm using utilitarian kind of industrialized paints on these pieces. And they also glow, and so they look differently based on the light that is on them. And I started getting really excited about those objects that came from the wall, but I also wanted them to start hanging down because I wanted to kind of talk about the environment, but cut the environment. I thought if I could get these things hanging down, I could also create another sensory experience for the viewer as they're in these spaces. And so these are all spray painted and screen printed. There's 1,000 of them that are down in the space downstairs. And so this is just some installation shots that I did in my house, trying to figure out how these would work together, how they would glow, and have this movement of the pieces together. Because of course, before you make anything, you have to kind of figure out what it's going to look like. So these are the beginning experiments for downstairs. And then I thought, what if they make sound? So one of my friends, Casey Mollet, he's a sound artist, and we've been talking for years about this idea of working together and collaborating in some kind of a way. But he found this technology that if you put something on top of plastic, it'll actually make the sound that the art is making on top of the plastic. So in essence, the art will make the sound. And this was, of course, very exciting to me. But it also creates a lot of logistical issues with how do you do this? How do you make the string go away? How do you hide it? How do you make the sound come out? How do you not ruin the piece? And I started thinking about the record that was sent up into space, right? The first sounds, the sounds of Earth that were sent up into space that aliens were supposed to somehow see this diagram on top of it and know how to play it, which I think is asking a lot, right? But this was sent up in 1977, the same year I was born. And so I had an affinity towards this kind of idea of contact at the moment that I was born. And so what I started doing over the course of a couple years was I have been collecting sounds. And I go on a lot of hikes. And I travel a lot because my parents instilled that value in me. Don't have a nice car, but you must travel. You don't have a nice TV, but you must travel. So on these different trips, what I did was I would not videotape, but I would voice memo people laughing, like my niece. She just happens to be in this twice. I have like 4 nieces, I think. But she's made it twice in here because there was this time we were in Rome for my brother's wedding, and she sees a bubble maker for the first time and is chasing it for hours. And these were memories I wanted to remember, so I would record these. And this is us running down the street in New York City, and this is my favorite place, which is White Sands, and this is Slot Canyon hikes. I didn't, of course, pick out all of the places that these voice memos were recorded from, but they were conversations with people that I recorded, or sentences. One of my favorite things is to think of the best sentence I heard of that day, and I record it. Like somebody will just say like a wonderful sentence, and then I'll record it. And so I work with Brad Morrow. He's an artist, and he's also one of my colleagues. And he was able to put all these voice memos together into a sound MP3 player that would be hooked up to the exciter. So there's an exciter behind this painting. So what I've done is I've made some parts of it really congested and then placed the exciter so you can't see it. And then we have a hole in the wall, and the line comes all the way down to a little machine right here that has a sensor. So when you walk in front of it, it goes off and you can hear these sounds. And those are the collected sounds, the sounds of my Earth, right, that are being brought back to you. And they go into a loop. And so every time you step in front of them, and they're behind 4 different paintings in an installation, the sound will change. So your experience will change with them. But there's sounds that you've heard before, right? Like frogs, or rain, or a helicopter, etc. So what I also did with this space was I wanted to make it a black box, basically, because I wanted you to walk into the space, and I wanted to utilize the physicality of the highly machined floor as a reflection base. And and I wanted to hide all the doors and all the different things that were in the space. So very nicely, the El Paso Museum of Art agreed to do that, which is a big ask, to paint the ceiling all black, to paint all the walls black. And so what we did was we outlined the areas where the pieces would go, and then we drew the imagery and filled it in with black. And so you can see these white outlines. Here are the pieces, and they have these standoffs that make them come off of the wall, so they have a little bit more of a way for you to see those shadows. And these are ones that are one plate, so they're just one. This one's a one as well. This is just all glow in the dark paint. I just like how soft it makes the whole room, right? It just changed the whole room, just having all the black work surrounding it. But you can also see the color reflected from the piece in front of it. And here you can see all the pieces hanging down from the ceiling. You can kind of see the little sensor underneath over there, so you'll know where to look for them when you go back down there. But we also lit the room in different ways. Over in the corner, you can see where the lighting is. That's colored light. Here you can kind of see the glitter coming through the pieces. But what I really wanted to happen when you walk into the space is you get turned around, and it feels like it's all encompassing, and you can't really see your way out of it. Here is the projection mapping. There's two pieces that have projection mapping in this installation, and these are coming out of the corner, and then they have the pieces up at top, but they're also reflected in the floor. So it's a video that's running on these specific pieces, and also it becomes color, so you'll see kind of color interrupting it if you watch it for a bit. This is a close-up. You can see these insect pins, so I like to reference this idea of taxonomies, classification. These are these objects that are alive to me that are now kind of dead but still alive, being pinned to the wall. This is the blue projection mapping on the other side of the wall that has its own video. And it's repetition of the same imagery over and over again. It's repetition of the same imagery that's cut up in the ceiling, that's on the paintings. Different sizes, different scales. And you can kind of see here, this disorientation that I'm trying to use all the time is that you're moving back and forth between the floor and the walls. And so all of that was done on purpose to make this kind of site-specific place where you don't know the beginning or the end, this unlinear kind of sense of time and space. There's another close-up. Here's another one. Here's from the side. Hopefully you guys have all seen this. Have you all seen it downstairs? Yeah. Here's another photo of the pieces. And this is something that I just said to my friend the other day, and I had to write it down because I don't remember things so well. But one of the things that I wanted you to feel when you're in this space is sometimes we have this like longing for something else or these kinds of feelings, and I like to think about it as that we're made up of all this energy. And there's all these other kinds of universes that are existing and all these other kinds of realities and time, and they're all kind of longing for us to come home to them. And really, I love making this work, but the most important part of it is how the viewer will experience it. And I just want to say thank you. This is the last slide, but these are a list of the many incredible people who came and worked on this exhibition. It was no easy feat. It was 16-hour days. It was many, many weeks. I don't know how many weeks it was. Or how many days, because they all became one giant day that didn't seem to ever end. But I'm extremely appreciative to all of their hard work and support to make this happen. So thank you so much. Appreciate your time.